Hello and welcome on SAP on Microsoft Azure Technical Enablement YouTube channel. My name is Goran Chandrich and I will talk to you today about the SAP NetWeaver licensing mechanism in Microsoft Azure Cloud. Now, probably some of you also you could face some situation where you could run into some invalid SAP license issue. So although you haven't maybe probably some installed valid license, you could out of the blue run into a situation where your valid license is become invalid. So on the NetWeaver ABAP system, the ABAP will automatically generate 28 days temporary license, and although it would generate the temporary license, user would get those kind of unpleasant pop-up. And on NetWeaver Java system, the Java system will shut down after 30 minutes, which is definitely not a pleasant situation for you as an SAP administrator. Now, in this and other series, we will explain how the licensing mechanism works, how it's work on premise, what is different on Azure, and what kind of possible situation you could execute that could lead to potentially that your valid license become an invalid, and the ways how you can troubleshoot and even prevent it. So let's start. Basically, when you install an SAP system, and temporary license would be automatically installed, and typically you would need to install a permanent license, which means you would need to go to SAP Service Marketplace, and there you would need to provide an SAP products name, version, SAP ID, and so on. And last but not least, you would need to provide a hardware key, so-called hardware key. So hardware key, it's bound to the host, to the virtual machine in Azure where the SAP message server is running. Now on the NetWeaver Java system, that would be an SCS instance, Central Services instance. And on NetWeaver ABAP system, it would be an ASCS instance, ABAP Central Services instance. Now, it's very rarely that you might maybe even have an old so-called DVE BMGS instance, where the M stands for the message server, where you could have a message server running inside of that instance. It's very unlikely because all the new installation are not installing anymore this old central instance. But maybe if you have an older configuration, you might run into such architecture. The hardware key basically you would get by running the following command, sup license get under cdadm user. Now it's important to mention that the way the input parameters that I use for the calculation in on-premise environment differ from the Azure cloud. So if we check on the physical on-premise, meaning both physical and virtual environment, on Windows, it would be used two parameters, namely Windows Computer SID or Secure ID, and the local host name. On Linux, it would be used the MAC address of the first valid network card. Now, important is to mention that if you have an installed valid license and if you change any of those input parameters, the valid license will become invalid due to change of the input parameters. For example, if you change the host name on the Windows, the valid license become invalid. If you execute the Windows sysprep, which would actually remove the existing computer SID and generate a new one, again, license invalid. On Linux, if you would exchange the network card, put a new one, same story, or maybe if you would have more network cards and you would change the order, the license will become invalid. Now, the input parameters or the way how the input parameters are specified in Azure, it's a bit different. So there is some news. And on Windows, in addition to Windows Computer SID and the local host name, we will have something which is called Azure VM Unique ID. And this change is implemented on Windows starting with those kernels here. So the 721 up to 742 patch level 31 and higher, of course. On Linux, the MAC address is not used anymore, but only the Azure VM Unique ID. And this change is introduced in the below kernel version of the SAP. Now, I mentioned the Azure VM Unique ID. So what is that? It's a unique 128-bit identifier for each Azure VM. It's introduced since 2014. It's encoded and stored in all Azure VMs and BIOS, both on Windows and Linux. You can get from either inside of VM, but also from outside, meaning from Azure PowerShell or Azure CLI. The typical scenarios would be that you could identify that VM is running on Azure, for example, could be used for reporting or general tracking, but a license is, of course, one big motivation, either for operating system or for the SAP. Now, it's important to mention that every new created VM will have a new and unique Azure VM ID. But there are also different way how the VM could be created. So typically, most of you would, most likely that you would create a new VM, for example, just by going to Azure portal and grabbing an existing VM image from the image gallery. But another way to create a VM is that you could clone an existing VM. So you could create a new VM from the existing VM through the copy or clone procedure. And basically, although let's say the new VM could have exactly the same operating system parameter, the host name would be changed, everything could be the same, but the Azure VM ID would be changed, meaning just the fact that you create a new VM ID, even from the existing VM, will cause that new created VM will have a new VM ID, and that would cause that the previous VM ID is basically changed. Now, Azure unique VM ID won't change if you would do the VM reboot, if you would shut down the VM, start, stop, or deallocate VM, if you execute VM service healing or restore, or redeploy VM, which means you would VM from one Azure host to another one. Now let's go to a demo and show you a bit practically how you can identify those kernel and actually the input parameters. So let's first maybe start with the Linux. So I'm here on the Azure portal and I open, here you would see you would have a Cloud Shell. It's a built-in Cloud Shell, it's Cloud Bash shell built in the Azure portal. I'm logged through the SSH on this Linux VM. So if I would check the folders, I would see I have an SCS instance. And if I would check, for example, the existing processes, I would see that yes, there is a message server running, meaning it's an enqueue server, which means an SCS instance running here. Let's check now the kernel version. So if I would run message underscore server ms, I would see that the kernel version is here 749. Now, if you would remember, Azure VM ID it's implemented, for example, in subkernel 745 patch level 111 or higher, which means I'm expecting that in this current 749 kernel version, the Azure VM ID as new parameter, it's there and is being used. But just to double check, what we can do is to use the sublicense command program. So with get, of course, you will get just the hardware key, but if you would run sublicense dash get and option trace equal to 2, a new file would be generated called dev-aslic. So if we would check the content, I'm not on a Windows, yes, I'm a Linux. If we would check the content of this file, we'll see some interesting information. And first, we'll see. Yes, I'm running on the Azure. It's the kernel is recognizing, and here you would see actually this is the input parameter, and this number sequence of number is actually this one input parameter, which is the Azure Unique VM ID. If we would do the same exercise on Windows, so I'm on Windows box, on Windows VM running Azure. I have a central system running here. So if I would check what instances are running, I would say, okay, it's an ASCS instance, meaning message server and enqueue is here. Let's now check the kernel version, for example. So let me type message underscore server, and basically we can see that kernel version is also 749. It's quite high, so it's higher than subkernel version 742 patch level 31. Expectation is this in higher kernel, the new kernel input parameters are used. But just to double check this, what we can do is again to run a sub license dash get trace equal to, and we will get the dev slick file. So if I would, actually it's interesting, I can use in a PowerShell the dev slick cat also command, not only type but also get. That's kind of cool, nice. So again, yeah, we are the kernel Azure SAP kernel is recognized. Yeah, it's running on Azure. And here in this big chunk is actually allocated 3 input parameters. So it start, the first one is the Windows computer unique ID, the long number starting with S. The second one, it's the host name, the local host name. So if I would just to double check, I will type host name, it's core-SAP, so it's okay. And the last part is Azure VM Unique ID. Now I mentioned that basically also we can get this Azure VM Unique ID using the PowerShell. So if I would use the new get as VM PowerShell command, I will get the VM ID, which is actually this number. So it's the same number. So let's summarize the whole stuff on Windows. I can, through the sub license get trace 2, I will get the dev slick file, and inside I will see the input parameters, 3 input parameters on Windows, namely it's a Windows computer SID, host name, and the Azure VM ID. Now, if I would use the PowerShell, I would get again the same VM ID. Don't be confused, it looks different, but actually it's not. So the last part of the block start with 2F54 on the right side, upper and lower, it's the same. The second one is B84D, it's also the same. On the third block from the right, it's a bit rotated, meaning EE42 becomes 42E and so on. So it's just a bit different formatting. It's a bit the letters and numbers a bit rotated, but actually it's the same VMID. On Linux, again, same command, and we will see the one input parameter, which is the Azure VM ID. Again, through the PowerShell, I can get the same VM ID. Again, don't be surprised that looks a bit different, but actually it's not. It's really the same. Just the first 3 blocks are just a bit rotated. So that would be all for the first part. What is coming in the second part, we'll talk about the possible scenarios, what could cause an invalid SAP license, and the way how you can, the solution for this, and even prevention and troubleshoot. So thank you. This would be and some useful SAP notes and blocks, but you can also check in parallel. And that would be all for the first part. Thank you for watching.